This is video 4 on risk management, part 2 of the risk assessment section. In this section, we're going to look at 2 more risk assessment techniques. The first will be failure modes, effects, and criticality analysis, and the second will be bow tie analysis. In failure modes and effects and criticality analysis, we're going to be looking at the hardware side of the system primarily, and how failures in that hardware can occur, and then anticipating the impact of these possible failures. So this is a very proactive approach to risk assessment. It's what can go wrong. It's asking you to come up with what can go wrong and what can happen as a result of that, as opposed to the more backwards-looking checklist approach, where you're trying to do that, but it's very much informed by what has happened in the past. So there's kind of 5 steps that you go through in order to do this analysis. You're going to list, and then look at the failure modes, determine effects, evaluate effects, and then determine how to control. So for the list, straightforward. You just generate a list of all the parts of hardware that could fail. Obviously, for a chemical plant or something of that scale, that's going to be a pretty long list, but you might be able to group things into categories and whatnot to keep it manageable. Now, for each item that you generated on that list, you're going to generate a second list that's the ways the part could fail. So we've got a list. Each list item has a sublist of the parts, the ways that they can fail. And then you're going to say, okay, so this part has failed. What happens? What is the effect of that failure? From there, you go to the evaluate the effects. So you've said, okay, this part fails in this way, that causes this. We go and we calculate the risk, which you remember is the probability times the consequence, although here they're calling it the criticality. Essentially, bigger numbers means things you should pay more attention to. And once you've evaluated the effects of the criticality, then that helps to direct your development of controls towards the most severe failure modes, the most critical problems that can arise from those failure modes. So let's work through an example to try and solidify this. Now, you'll remember there was the large mining truck, and it ran over the small pickup truck. This is an example we've mentioned a few times up to this point. So let's do a failure modes, effects, and criticality analysis of the truck as a piece of equipment. So list, what are the things that can fail in the truck? Well, the tires, the engines, the brakes, lots of parts. Failure modes. Okay, so now we take out each of those. So how can the tire fail? Well, flat tire is one way. How about the brakes? Well, balded brake pads would be a way that they would fail. So you see, for each component, we list the ways it can fail. Now, what are the effects of that failure? So if the tire fails and goes flat, you could lose control of the vehicle. So clearly that's not a good thing. If you lose control of the vehicle, what could be the results? Well, damaged equipment and injured drivers. So now we can apply a quantitative assessment to the danger of the failed tire. And once we do that analysis, we say, well, that would be a really big concern based on the possibility of this happening and the damage associated with it. So what controls can we put in place to minimize the risk associated with failed tires? We can put in controls such as inspecting the tires daily and make sure that they get replaced at the end of their operational lifetimes. So replace them every 10,000 kilometers. Instead of waiting for the tire to fail, you replace it before it fails. Both of these are control measures that you put in place to reduce the risk associated with the hazard of tire failure. Now, second type of risk assessment we're going to look at in this video is bow tie analysis. Bow tie analysis is another proactive approach to predicting and avoiding unwanted events, but it's very flexible, and then it can also be used reactively after an event has occurred to, in an investigation typically, to identify ways to ensure the same thing doesn't happen in the future. It's a little more in-depth, so we're going to go through this in detail. So there we are on the screen. You can see our bow tie. It's a nice knot in the middle and two big bow parts off to either side. And in the center of your bow tie is your hazard. So everything revolves around the hazard in bow tie analysis. We start off with the threats associated with that hazard. Threats are things that could cause the hazard to occur. And you can see they start off on the left-hand side, the widest. There's many threats that could lead to the manifestation of a particular hazard, and they're going to get funneled into the hazard with this bow tie shape. On the other side of the bow tie, we have the consequences. So when the hazard manifests, what are the consequences? The things that go wrong, the damages to your objectives that occur when the hazard manifests. These are the unwanted things, the damage, etc., fatalities. So now we have our bow tie started. We've got threats leading to hazards, hazards leading to consequences. So what do you do to protect against that? Well, between the threats and the hazards, you want to have controls. Controls, we've talked about a few times up to this point, are protective measures that are put in place to prevent threats from releasing the hazard. For instance, personal protective equipment, engineering controls, administrative controls. You'll recall we mentioned those earlier in the Understanding Risk module. And then on the other side of the hazard, we want to talk about recovery measures. These are actions that you take to minimize the effect of the hazard or recover when the hazard manifests as an unwanted event. So now we've got our bow tie. We have threats. We have the controls to prevent the threats from causing the hazard to manifest. We have recovery measures to, once the hazard manifests, prevent it from causing consequences. And then we have the consequences on the right-hand side. And so you can see that bow tie analysis is a very powerful mental model for conceptualizing how hazards can be triggered through threats and the results of those hazardous events causing consequences. It's very visual, and it's a good illustration of the causality of the situation that you're examining. And what's really powerful is that it's also very much encourages this divergent thinking to identify different threats, different consequences. You start out with the hazard and you branch out into all the possibilities that you can determine. So it's a very powerful and effective risk assessment tool that really gives you a leg up on dealing with hazards and risk. And that's the end of this section. In the next video, video 4, section 3, we're going to work through a detailed example of using bow tie analysis.